All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the first half of American presidential history, covering our first 22 presidencies, all the way from George Washington to Grover Cleveland. We're going to see how the highest office in the land evolved. It's a wild ride, from the birth of the nation straight through an agonizing civil war and right into the really complex era of Reconstruction. To make sense of this massive 100-year span without getting bogged down, we've broken it all down into four distinct flowing eras: the founders and early republic, expansion and rising tensions, the Civil War and fracture, and finally, Reconstruction and reform.
So let's kick things off with part one, Founders and Early Republic, Establishing the Nation. Okay, so looking at our first six presidents, it obviously all starts with George Washington. As a hero of the Revolutionary War, the guy was actually elected unanimously by the Electoral College twice. He steered a really careful course of neutrality before stepping down. He was followed by John Adams, a massive voice for independence and the very first president to ever live in the White House. This early era stretches through a bunch of brilliant figures, wrapping up with our sixth president, John Quincy Adams, whose big claim to fame was paying off almost the entire national debt. Pretty incredible, right? Now, check out this number, 800,000. It really shows the sheer scale of Thomas Jefferson's defining achievement. Our third president, and the main author of the Declaration of Independence, was a pretty complex guy. I mean, he was this fierce defender of individual liberty who paradoxically owned slaves. And, interestingly, while he actively opposed a strong central government, he used the power of that exact government to double America's size. He bought a staggering 800,000 square miles of territory right from France. You know, these early presidents face wildly contrasting foreign policy challenges, really trying to balance peaceful diplomacy with necessary conflict. For instance, our second president, John Adams, managed to skillfully avoid an all-out war with France. But on the flip side, you've got James Madison. Now, Madison was a towering intellectual figure in passing the U.S. Constitution, even though he was physically America's shortest president at just 5'4". But unlike Adams, he didn't have the luxury of peace. He was literally forced into the War of 1812 to fight Great Britain just to uphold America's rights at sea. Then we get to James Monroe, who was actually the very last founding father to serve as president. He established this absolutely crucial diplomatic boundary known as the Monroe Doctrine. It was essentially a firm line in the sand warning Europe not to meddle in American affairs, and it still heavily influences American geopolitics today. Domestically, he also had to navigate the incredibly tense issue of slavery, passing legislation to restrict it to existing slave states and new territories south of the Missouri Compromise line. Plus, he supported the colonization of Liberia by free African Americans. Fun fact, that's exactly why Liberia's capital city is named Monrovia, right in his honor. Which naturally brings us to part two, expansion and rising tensions, growth and division. Here we're looking at the timeline for our next five presidents, and things start getting a bit bumpy. It kicks off with the rise of Andrew Jackson. He was a no-nonsense soldier and the founder of the Democratic Party. His style was so fiercely authoritarian that his political opponents, the Whigs, literally branded him a dictator. He's followed by Martin Van Buren, whose time in office was completely dominated by America's first major financial crash. Honestly, this whole string of tumultuous presidencies really highlights a rapidly changing and increasingly divided young nation. But we have to talk about the dark realities that came with this aggressive westward expansion. Under Andrew Jackson, we see the tragic, forced relocation of Native American tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. And this expansionism just kept rolling. Later on, James K. Polk, who was a hardcore believer in westward growth, actively provoked a war with Mexico. That conflict ultimately scooped up another 500,000 square miles of North American territory. That's what created the modern borders we know today for places like California, Nevada, and Utah. And then there's this astonishing number, 30. That is the total number of days William Henry Harrison spent in office. He was a lifelong soldier, mostly fighting Native Americans, and he decided to give the longest inaugural speech in history. Tragically, just 30 days after delivering it, he died of pneumonia. So he became the very first president to die in office. His vice president, John Tyler, had to step up, becoming the first VP to ever ascend to the presidency this way, only to be promptly expelled from his own political party for vetoing all their bills. Talk about drama, right? So, as America is rapidly expanding its borders, tensions are violently escalating between the northern free states and the southern slave states. The absolute core of this growing national fracture was a deep, unresolvable disagreement over whether slavery would be allowed to expand into all these newly acquired American territories. It's like a powder keg, and the stage was perfectly set for an inevitable crisis. Now, looking at this table, you can see how the four presidencies leading up to the 1860s utterly failed to stop the country's accelerating slide toward war. Zachary Taylor literally threatened to hang secessionists, but then he suddenly died of a stomach illness. Millard Fillmore managed to support an uneasy, very short-lived compromise. Then Franklin Pierce, dealing with the terrible trauma of his son's recent death, allowed brutal violence to just engulf Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. And finally, James Buchanan. His attempts to mediate failed so abjectly that it directly led the Democratic Party to split and the southern states to officially leave the Union. And that powder keg ignites in Part 3, Civil War and Fracture. The nation tears apart. This is a brief but absolutely monumental timeline. It covers just 2 presidencies, but they completely define the survival of the United States. You have America's first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who guided the nation through the war, and his immediate successor, Andrew Johnson, who inherited the absolute chaos that followed. Abraham Lincoln, of course, led the North to victory, and he fundamentally changed the course of human history by issuing the executive order that freed all Southern slaves. It's an incredible legacy. But as we know, his monumental presidency met a tragic end. He became the first president to be assassinated, shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. So that leaves us with a massive cliffhanger. What happens to a deeply fractured nation after the war is won, but its leader is suddenly gone? The country was technically reunited on paper, but culturally and politically, it was entirely broken. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner born into poverty who had sided with the Union during the war, suddenly found himself in charge of trying to put all these broken pieces back together. Well, it didn't go smoothly. Johnson immediately clashed with lawmakers, totally blocking Congress's attempts to impose reforms on the South. This sparked incredible political outrage and actually led to his impeachment. And the margin by which he retained his presidency? Exactly 1 vote in the Senate. Just 1 single vote. He was acquitted, but the government remained deeply, deeply divided. Which brings us to our final era. Part 4, Reconstruction and Reform, Healing and Corruption. This final timeline tracks the presidents of the Reconstruction and the Gilded Age periods. We start with the legendary Civil War Union hero, Ulysses S. Grant, and carry through a string of leaders who had to navigate a rapidly industrializing nation that was really struggling with its post-war identity, taking us all the way to Grover Cleveland. Now, during this era, progress was often reversed by messy political compromises. On one hand, President Grant used the military to protect former slaves from white supremacist violence in the South, but simultaneously, he was overseeing wars against Native Americans out in the Great Plains. Then, to heal political wounds after a heavily disputed and incredibly violent election, Rutherford B. Hayes made a really devastating compromise. He withdrew federal troops from the South, and tragically, that allowed white supremacists to violently regain power there. If you look at the late 19th century, the defining theme here is a constant, almost deadly struggle to reform a bloated and deeply corrupt civil service. James A. Garfield tried to take on this corruption, but he was tragically shot by an embittered lawyer just 4 months into his term. Then you have Chester Arthur, an Irish Baptist preacher's son who totally defied expectations and successfully reformed a lot of government bureaucracy. And finally, Grover Cleveland, the first Democrat president since the Civil War. He famously used his presidential veto with absolute gusto to block anything he considered federal overreach, even denying pensions for Civil War veterans. So I want to leave you with this final thought. After surviving a full century of chaotic birth, massive expansion, a bloody civil war, and deep-rooted corruption, how would the American presidency evolve to face the modern world? The foundation was firmly laid, but the 20th century was waiting just around the corner. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer of our first 22 presidents.